data. We set some of the groundwork for the discussion, and we ended with the discussion question, which I had you all reflect on and write upon. And in a little bit, this is not exactly a bait and switch, but it's a prompting for you to do this thinking. So part of the example for today is my grappling with that similar sort of question, right? How are we to grapple with what we might see as the dual challenges of the development of technology, and then how it specifically might apply to digital data in particular, right? The question being, is there a moral reckoning that we can frame out with technologies, right? The good or bad, or is there a way of saying that these things are problematic or are inherently tied to society in a particular way? And then the additional question of what sometimes gets called determinism, or technological determinism. The question of, is technology inevitable? Does it have to happen? At what level does human interaction frame out? And perhaps we can even sort of frame this out as having two different points, because you could say on the one hand, and we'll get into this, but I'm sort of give you the big picture now. On the one hand, we can ask the question, is technology inevitable? Is technological progress inherent to the human project in some way, as we sort of rooted in Marx last time? Or is it, on the other hand, an entirely human endeavor? Right? Are we the ones, is society entirely determining the technological forms? Right? You see the sort of balance. You could say, is technology determining society, or is society determining technology? Sort of the two far ends of that framework, and how might our interpretations of that impact our understandings or the way that we want to do this investigation? I want to try to sort of square that circle today, or try to give you my analysis of this, which is why I wanted you to do the reflection last night, so you don't just parrot my own ideas back to me. I want you to have your own thinking first, and then we can develop the other ones. And so I want to sort of set out these initial claims, these initial framings, and develop them into a critique. And I'd say there are two core themes or ideas that I'm going to try to present as solutions to this problem today. The first, and I'll sort of put them over here as things I will come back and reference here.
Funny when it moved. That moved.
Yeah, I'll be all right.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I can reach over.
Yeah, well, that's not bad. It's not too much of a solid.
The first one is what I'm going to call the concept of the milieu. And the second is the idea of what I'm going to call post-structural data. This is the sort of formulation or the two main themes that I want to try to get at today. I'm not expecting you to know what either of these two things are currently, but I wanted to sort of put them on board as our initial setting out of what we're going to try to talk about. I think that by appealing to or developing these two ideas or these two frames, we can try to solve this problem of determinism. We can try to solve this question of data. But before we get into that, I want to begin again with an example that is probably, I thought about if this example applied to soccer or football. You'll have to tell me I don't know enough about it, because I like baseball. Baseball is my sport. And baseball is an interesting sport if you're interested in data. For a lot of reasons that may be obvious, may not be obvious, but baseball is a very data-oriented game, right? The idea of statistics is inherent in baseball. You talk about batting averages, you talk about wins above replacement, you have all of these sort of statistical markers, and in a way, baseball is a very useful game. There's a book by Kathy O'Neill called Weapons of Math Destruction. If you really want the pun name full on, it's a little too far. But she makes this example also, takes up the question of baseball, which got me thinking about it, which is that one of the reasons why baseball is so useful for thinking about data and why it becomes so data-oriented is because it's a finite game. Right? There are defined, easy-to-measure actions at all times, right? You have this set of single events that can be measured and can be marked, and then you can combine them into sort of data that is able to do statistical analysis, right? You can track every single pitch. You can track how every batter approaches every single pitch. You can track how often a hit happens, how far the hits go. You can do all of this sort of statistical data collection. There are only a sort of a small number of outcomes. And I think what makes studying a game like baseball interesting is that when you look at the game, you have at your fingertips all of these different data points. You have all of these different statistical formulations, but you still have to make individualized decisions, because the thing we're always interested in is not necessarily the statistics, but how the statistics inform particular decision making or particular individualized events, right? No matter how bad or how good somebody's batting average is, how good they are statistically at hitting the ball, they still have to stand in the plate and take a swing at something, right? And I think this creates an incongruity or a mismatch between the use of statistics to tell us something and the sort of individualized action of the game. And so this is sort of sets up what I'm going to call statistical rationality, right? The logic of statistics breaks down when it's applied to the single event. You still have to pitch to a batter or hit the ball. And this is why, I think soccer or football is trending in a statistical direction, right? There's ideas about how much, like control of the ball you have, or momentum development and things like that. But I think it's less so than baseball, which, because it happens in discrete events, has this sort of statistical potential,
yeah,
right?
Football has nothing of that. It's the complete opposite.
Yeah, it's just sort of this continuous flow. But I think there's an attempt to sort of try to use data to analyze the game, right? To sort of help you make decisions about what you should do or how you should do things. Again, baseball's my sport, so that's where I come down in. And so I think what we can see here is that this usage of data creates this unique form of rationality that we'll develop in a little bit later, that's both derived from and prioritizes a statistical form of reasoning. And so it lets us come back to these central questions that we're doing. Because you can do this sort of analysis with politics, you can do it with society, but I think one of the things about baseball is that no one's saying that, you can't measure that thing, right? If I want to say, I want to measure your ideology, what you think about politics, that's a very hard thing to measure, right? I could ask you a series of questions like, who do you vote for? Okay, is that a determination of ideology? No, it's sort of a representation. I could ask you a bunch of questions about your opinions on particular issues, but even on the best case scenario, right, where I've got an exhaustive list of questions and I've got all of these answers from you, and I can put it all together and say, okay, I think you have this I can map out your ideological framework. It's still a snapshot of your particular viewpoints, right? And if I say, this is your ideological approach or your ideology, I'm also assuming that nothing changes, right? I'm saying, you might have a change of heart tomorrow. Something might happen that changes your mind, or something that wasn't salient becomes salient because something else happens in the world.
And you're also assuming that there are no contradictions between its own ideology.
That's the other problem, right?
Which is
People
huge.
are contradictory all the time.
Yeah.
I'm lying. because people tend to lie to accommodate the social norm.
Yeah,
in that kind of questionnaires.
Yeah, right? If I'm asking you a set of questions, even if I promise that it'll be anonymous or whatever, you might still lie because you don't want me to really know what's going on.
Yeah.
Which is that's a whole different interesting can of worms. Like, should I be interested in the fact that you want to lie? Is that part of your own ideology, your willingness to lie about it? Right? It's a whole different set of things. I think baseball's a little more straightforward. Right? But even then, it's this idea like, oh, it's a snapshot of the past. I can't exactly say what's going to happen. And so if this is the way that we're thinking about things, if this is what data is, then we get back to this question of like, well, what is the impact? What does it do, and what is its relationship to society? How should we understand this interaction of data and technology with society? And this is why I think Langdon Winner has this frame where he calls technology a form of life. He draws this from Wittgenstein and Max Weber and some other people. But so Langdon Winner has this proposal. He says, I think we should understand technology as a form of life, or as a way of shaping and modifying the things that we...
Can you just write the name?
Oh, yeah, sure. Langdon Winner was an early theorist of technology, of politics of technology, writing in like the 80s and 90s. He's still alive today, but he's retired and moved to rural Maine. So, which is like the middle of nowhere. Like went off and lives in the woods now, which, I can't really blame him that much. And I think what this does is there's a temptation to say that technology, or the approach to technology, or especially the approach to data, is ideological, right? That there's an ideology of technology, there's an ideology of data that we're following, right? I think there's a tendency to say that, to push that understanding that, the ways in which we think data or these new sort of digital technological forms are going to change our lives, are going to do these things that we have to adopt them, happens with AI also, right? This logic of you have to adopt AI or else it's going to pass you by could be seen as an ideology. But I want to resist that. I don't think ideology or ideological formulations is the right way to go about this. And so I sort of follow Foucault in this regard, and thinking that appealing to this is ideology is a mistake. So a form of life versus something like ideology. And I think ideology is a mistake. Why? Well, again, I'm going to put it this way. Foucault has this quote where he says that the problem with ideology is that it always stands in virtual opposition to something else, which is supposed to count as truth. That when we think about ideology, what it is it's sort of a disguising of the truth, right? If I say you're motivated by your ideology, or you're acting a particular way because you're acting out of an ideology, in some ways I'm accusing you of being maybe not rational in the full regard. Or maybe I'm accusing you of saying, you're choosing your ideological commitment over a more sort of truthful understanding of the world. Right? That tends to be the negative association with ideologies. And it's because of that, I think that framing out a technology as ideological is kind of problematic. Because I don't think it's true that data, or like our societal approach to things like digital data, is obscuring a real or evident truth, but that data operates as its own form of truth. That it has this form of life, that it is creating an idea of the world that it is basing its understandings off of, that we're basing our understandings off of. right?
Isn't ideology more of a lens through which you see the world? Like, this is right, this is wrong, this should be like this should be like that?
Yeah.
Because, like, your definition of ideology, I don't know, I hear it like, it's very, like, political ideology, not necessarily ideology in and of itself.
So I think the challenge here is that, I mean, ideology itself is a loaded term, right? That it has these different things. And so when you're saying, oh, something is ideological, you're building all of that. I think one of the frames is that it's like, oh, a political ideology is acting this way. But also, even in the way that you described it as a lens by which you see the world.
Yeah, but
right? You're putting
descendant.
something in between you and the world as it really is.
Because
right?
we're talking about morality and objectivity, which is very difficult to, like, not everything is good and bad, as we said before. So,
Precisely.
So you have to, like, you need to differentiate between what is right, what is wrong, and that's where kind of ideology comes in, right? Sort of.
I think you're on to me a little bit, right? I think the problem with calling it ideology, or the problem with calling it ideological, is that it pushes you in a direction that I don't think is precise enough, let's say. Right? That the idea is that framing it out as fundamentally ideological is not precise enough. And so, what I mean by it's operating in its own form of truth is something that we talked about last time a little bit, that the design of digital technology, prioritizing a specific type of experience, or a specific type of expertise, has always sort of trended towards technocratic rules, right? We can say, oh, what is this form of life that is created by data? It tends to be like technocratic. Or the idea that you can use the technology to solve discrete problems in the world. That it creates this way of, I think, I want to adopt, I'm trying to say it without adopting exactly your language because I think you're there. Right? It's not necessarily like a lens of seeing the world, but it is a context shaping by which we're able to operate inside of the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right? And this is, I would say, essentially a terminological problem, a problem of terminology, right? That when you say ideology, you have all of this baggage that I don't want to fully develop. And as we talked about last time, also the first generation of the Frankfurt School, we talked about Herbert Marcuse last time and other people, they understand this relationship between what we might call the scientific and the technical domain and the social and political domain. Because one of the other things that I want to make sure that we're doing is that we are bringing together the social, the technological, and the political, right? So there's this framing out that on the one hand we have, we'll make these sort of a set of dichotomies here. What we might call the scientific, fully lost this pen. I'm doing a lot of setup here, and I don't know, but just sort of bear with me as we sort of run this out. If you look at, say, philosophy, but in particular a strain of philosophy called critical theory in which we're sort of operating here, you'll note that one of the things that happens is that because of a complicated set of philosophical reasons, there tends to be a desire to separate how we understand the world into two sort of realms. One realm is the scientific and the scientific technological realm, and one is the social political realm. And there's a strand of thinking that says that these realms are distinct. That what is true for the scientific world, the technological world, is different from the social and the political world. Right? You see this not only in sort of philosophical debates, but in political debates sometimes too, right? You see the idea that you don't make science political. I don't know if you hear this term as much in Uruguay as you do in the United States now, but you're hearing it a lot in the United States now about like, oh, you need to keep politics out of science, or science is becoming, and that happens from all sort of sides of the political spectrum of like, oh, science is becoming political. In the philosophical realm, there's a version of critical theory. We're not going to talk about Habermas too much, but basically the idea is that the way that you can make politics happen is that you sort of isolate it. And if democracy is about deliberation, if democracy is about talking to people, what you need to do is you need to sort of separate it from these things like science and technology and these other formulations that only sort of get in the way of us talking to each other. By calling it a form of life, though, what Langdon Winter is doing is he's trying to bring these two ideas together. He's trying to say that the things that form our lives, the way that shape the ways in which we live our lives, are indeed technological. They have these technological outputs that show us that this division here is not as clean as we might want it to be. Or it's not as clean as some other people try to argue that it is. That you can't fully separate the scientific and the social and political. And one of the ways that you can't do this is you recognize that technologies, in their form of life, through this technocratic vision, they shape what we think of as the future. Question mark here, so it's equally sort of framed. Right? Technologies wield significant power to shape what we think of as the future, or what the future could be. And there's another author, I'm just going to rattle off names that you don't have to remember. His name is Sun Ha Hong. He's at North Carolina now. He was at I forget where it was beforehand, but he's at the University of North Carolina now, and he talks about this as what he calls the social life of techno-futures. But basically, that the technologies of the present are impacted by the imaginaries of the past. Or to put it in a different way, that the vision of the futures that we have are based on the technologies that we have with us today. This idea of one of the things that this form of life does, this technology does, is that it sort of shows us a vision of what the future is. And it plays a sort of, to quote him, a key role in shaping collective expectations of what technologies can do and how they can create new forms of life. So this idea that we can separate easily the scientific and the social and the political is shown to be insufficient for doing an accurate explanation of politics, because if politics is trying to shape the world we want to live in, the idea of politics is we use politics in order to shape the kind of societies we want to have, the kind of worlds we want to live in, then we have to recognize technology's impact on that shaping. Right? We talked about this a little bit last time, sort of obliquely. We talked about like AI in the future is one of these prime examples. It's shaping what we think of as the future, what it can be, what the potentials are. And so this means one of the dangers, and I know this might be speaking, like preaching to the choir, as it were, as you're all here now, but one of the dangers of not studying the political and social impacts of technologies is that you think about these things only in this siloed way and sort of miss out on how the technology is impacting it. Because I'll give some examples to think about this. One of the things that we see a lot, and it gets talked about in social science as path dependency. Does anybody know what path dependency is? Okay? Sociological, political sciencey kind of framing. No one's run into path dependency. The idea of path dependency is that initial decisions set the stage for what future decisions can be made. You make a decision and it sets you on a path that means that it is very hard to change or move you off of that path in the future. There's a great famous example of this that you are, I would say, about 75% of you are staring at right now. What might it be? You're not staring at it. You are.
You.
No, you're all staring at me because I'm important. Your computer. What part of your computer?
Screen.
No, wrong. 50% chance you were wrong.
Keyboard.
The keyboard. Why is your keyboard laid out the way it is?
Because of the writing machines from the past.
What?
The setup QWERT.
Yeah.
Because of the machines in the past, the writing machine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that the vocal letters are not as close. The letters that you most use are not close by, so that they don't get stuck.
This is the famous story. I had this and I looked up. It is 50% whether or not this is actually true or not. But the story goes that the reason the keyboard is set up the way it is today is because in the past, with typewriters, when you pressed the key, it was a mechanical action that actually imprinted the key. And if you typed too fast, you jammed them up.
Yeah, it happens.
Yeah. And so that true happens. The mythology comes in as you rearrange the keyboard to make you type slower. There was some debate about if that was the original reason why that happened. But I'm happy to say it is.
I mean, it's
right?
just so that the letters that you always use don't go together.
Aren't tied together.
So
yeah.
you always
But what does that mean for us today?
we have an inefficient keyboard.
Yeah.
You spend more time on your screen. You're done.
Learning how to type is harder, right? Because of the typewriter. That's path dependency, right? Because if you wanted to change it, how hard would it be to change everybody's keyboard to something different?
Take a long time.
It would take a long time, and it's not worth making the switch. So this early decision on the design of typewriters has locked us in to a path that is very difficult to overcome. Right? A technological decision created this thing that has overarching impacts.
You could say the same thing with driving on the right-hand side. The whole
Yeah.
world drive on the left, but we changed.
Yeah, you make arbitrary decisions about things you do, or the difference between again, this might be too old, but there was a point where there was a debate about whether or not we would adapt Blu-ray or HD DVDs, right? Why did we end up with Blu-ray? There's no reason, right? It's essentially arbitrary.
Someone decided.
Yeah. Someone decided that they're going to sell this type and not this type. And so what it does is it creates these path dependencies. And so what this also means is that if we deny that, we succumb to techno-futuristic thinking when we think of technology as broken free from the society that creates it. If we think that our computers are designed as sort of singular, non-contextual objects outside of a socio-political framework, we can't explain something like the reason our keyboards are oriented the same way. And maybe you say, okay, that's true, and maybe because the other argument is that it's actually kind of more efficient to have the keyboard set up in this way because it uses more of your fingers to use the keyboard, right? That's sort of the counter argument. and say, okay, so maybe there's a reason to do it for the keyboard. But you're typing on your phone. You're not even using the same like ergonomic framework in which to do that. And yet your keyboard on your phone is set up like your keyboard on your computer, which is set up like the keyboard on the typewriter. So to say that these decisions are different because they have different things that, scientific technological thinking is rationalistic and we're trying to create this singular object, and political thinking is messy and compromised, is to say that these things are not the same, and that the forms of life that we had in the past are impacting what the future is. And so to try to understand this, to bring this together, we come to my first thing that I want to grapple with, which is the idea of the milieu. This is a concept that I am pulling from what I will describe as a punishingly difficult French media theorist. Do you know Simondon?
Yeah.
Punishingly difficult French media theorist who wrote a book called On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects.
All the French are punishingly difficult.
What?
All the French are
Yeah. I mean, he's worse than like Foucault or other people, but he's really hard. Even the title of the book, if you title your book On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects, you know you're in for a slog. But basically, to simplify this idea that I think is useful, is so Simondon is trying to understand the context in which a technological object operates, right? There are contextual factors. There's context that is important for understanding the ways in which technology, and indeed, for Simondon, it's all objects work. Not just things that we traditionally think of as technologies, but there's a context to everything. And then he has this whole sort of metaphysical theory about the way in which technologies become more attuned to their context over time. And that's his idea of progress, right? Progress is an object becoming more attuned to its project. He calls it concretization, and it's very French. But basically the idea, or the thing that I think is useful here, is that if these contextual factors become misaligned, then the technologies themselves risk becoming incomprehensible. And his example is a clock that is tied to an electrical grid. So there's that idea of, this is sort of his particular example, so it's tied to his period of time, but you can synchronize a clock to an electrical grid, and you can say, instead of all right, I don't know why all my examples are all super old. This is even older than me. But in the past, you had clocks that you had to wind up to keep them going, right? Then so they operated either by a spring or by something else, and you sort of had to keep them going in that way. And one of the technological innovations that says, okay, if we plug a clock into an electrical grid, we can accomplish two things. One, you never have to wind the clock up again, but also you can make sure the clock is regular because you can use the physical characteristics of the electricity, the hertz at which it vibrates, as a way of timing out the seconds. So you say, if you have a clock that's synchronized to a 60 hertz electrical grid, you calculate how many sort of vibrations happen in a second, and you say, the clock can always be on time because it is using the electrical grid to synchronize this. But what Simondon does, or argues, is that this only works because there's a context that is appropriate for the thing. If you had a different electrical grid, if you had a 50 hertz electrical grid, the clock wouldn't work. Or it would work, but it wouldn't work in a way that is visible to us, or that is comprehensible to us, because it would still take seconds, it would still operate regularly, and from the positionality of the clock, nothing is wrong. Right? If you think of the clock as an object, it's still keeping exactly regular time in the way that it was designed to do so. But from our perspective of somebody who is using the clock to read the time, it would become a useless object because it wouldn't sort of display accurate time. And that disconnect shows us the importance of the context or the milieu in which the clock operates. This is surprisingly, this is the clearest example that Simondon has in this book. I can only imagine the other examples there. So I'll stop. Questions? Do we see the sort of point that's being made here? The point is that technical objects are only understandable within this milieu, this contextual framing in that they exist. And they actually can exist at the intersection of multiple milieus, right? So he has one of the ideas, like you could have a technological milieu and a geographic milieu. That there's the difference between it works in a particular place. So the idea of it being in the clock synchronized to a 60 hertz electrical grid is a geographic milieu, right? Because it's tied to a place with a larger decision. Versus a technological milieu is like all the intricate workings of the clock itself. Or to put it a different way, I could make this even more abstract, right? The clock works because it exists at a place where we have a collective understanding of what time is, and that time is important to us, right? You could imagine that we could live in a hypothetical place where we don't have the same understanding of time. Right? We have a very regimented understanding of time in modern society, right? Like milliseconds, even more than that, right? You can divide time into this incredibly granular thing. You know, class starts at 6:30. That has a particular meaning to you. You exist as part of this time. You clock into a job. You clock out of the job. There's a whole valence of time that sort of frames out this. And so we live in a geographic milieu that values time in a particular way. So the fact that the clock could be right and could be wrong is something that only has meaning because of our geographic milieu. If you lived in a society that didn't care about time, it wouldn't matter what the clock said. Are you with me? I know, we did jumped head first into esoteric French philosophy. But the argument here is that technology and society, the idea of the milieu, is a way to grapple with this idea that technology and society thus make up a collective, broad spectrum, one that is intertwined, inseparable, and multi-causal. This idea of the milieu is how I get out of the determinism question. The idea here is to say that essentially that the determinism question is the wrong question to ask. Right? The determinism question is, let's see if I can use a different color. It's like, boil down, the determinism question is simply, do we create technology, or does technology create us?
Because What do you mean by create? Because you're not using the same create in each phrase. One is more philosophical and the other one is more literal.
In what way? Yeah, true, granted. But this is me sort of trying to like boil this down to something that I can write on the board without boring you all to death. But the idea is essentially, is technology sort of an output of human action? Or does the technology impact the human action, right? Like, this is technology creating us, this is the Marxist position, right? The historical materialist position that you can reduce all human existence, all ideology, all religion, everything is superstructure to the Marxist sort of means of production, right? That it is the productive forces in the world that create what we think of as us, our societies, our existences, these sorts of things, right?
Would you say that like the historical milieu of a technology is what shapes the morality of it that we discussed yesterday, being good or bad?
This is where I'm going, right? Is that what I think, so hold on, let me explain, let me get through this and I'll come back to you because you're ahead of me here, which is good, but I want to make sure we're all marching together, right? So the idea here is are we following this, or is this, the other turn is the sort of neutrality argument that we started with. I'm sort of running towards yours. It's like, if we purely create technology, then the knife is just the knife, and it's only our sort of existence that puts meaning into it. My argument here is to essentially say that the question of the milieu that you were sort of getting at is a way to say that both of these questions are the wrong way of thinking about it. That we both create and are created by technology. Right? To go back to your sort of framing about is it good or bad, the milieu would say that the technologies that we create are reflective of the sort of moral systems or social structures and social formations that we already have, while also shaping them and reinscribing them in different ways, right? That you can't say that one is purely sort of dominant over the other. You have to recognize them as complex and intertwined and multi-causal. You can't just say that it's one or the other. And so this is what I mean by I proposed this question to you, and it's like, this is the puzzle, right? And this concept of the milieu is how I get out of this puzzle. I don't know if you find that convincing or not, but this is the sort of way of saying the problem with asking the question that I asked you to grapple with. I'm going to tell you that it's a bad question that I asked you to write 500 words on. That's why I'm telling you now and not before you wrote it, because then all of your answers would be, this is a bad question. No. I wanted you to think about it yourself. This is why I think it's a bad question to ask if technology is good or bad. Because I think technology is good or bad in the same way that society is good or bad. That what we think of as the good uses and the bad uses and the neutral uses of the technology are themselves created, inscribed, and reinscribed by a society that has particular visions about particular things. I think some of you were getting there last time, and I cut you off because I didn't want to get too far into this and I wanted you to think about it yourself. But the idea here is essentially to say that if we're asking the question, is a knife good or bad? You say, well, we could use it to stab, or we could use it to cook food. And you say, well, no, I think the more interesting question is like, what elements of society accept the levels of violence that we say, okay, we need an instrument that is useful for both stabbing you and stabbing a chicken. Because you could imagine a fully vegetarian society would have no need for a knife that does stabbing. right?
Probably.
Something like that. So you could say then, okay, what this reflects is our society's milieu of violence. That we have a form of violence, that we now have particular lines where the violence is acceptable and not acceptable. It's acceptable to chop the head off of a chicken. It's less acceptable to do it to your neighbor.
So like what you were trying to say yesterday about the form of the knife was more like about the pointy thing, rather than the fact that we are cutting.
I mean, I'm using the pointy thing now, right? As I think it is, but I think you could make it about cutting also.
Yeah, but you could like cut things and not try to like cut humans. But like the pointy thing is like the result of the idea that you have to stab someone.
Yeah, or that cutting things are an acceptable existence that we have, right? That it's okay to chop up a chicken or what have you. Like, but you could easily, I think what I'm trying to say about it is that we live in what Simone would call a geographic milieu in which this is acceptable. And you might imagine, there might be a society, you could imagine a society where that is sort of militantly vegetarian and views violence towards any living creature as equally violent. And at that point, the knife would not be acceptable in any shape or form. And so this question about technology creating us is that these things are intertwined and reflective of each other. And that you can't just say, oh, it's good or bad. But also, you don't want to say the third, and you also similarly can't say that it is neutral. You have to say that it is part of the society that is creating it, that it is reflective of the society. This is true also if you look at, say, the development of the printing press, I think is another good example of this. You read about, like when you're in, I don't know, I'll assume that your history education is roughly the same as mine, where like, I don't know, you're in like 4th or 5th grade and they're like, you learn about the history of the world and you're like, the printing press is this revolutionary thing and there's this dude named Gutenberg who lived in Germany and he just like thought up the printing press and was like, why are we writing things down? That takes too long. Boom, printing press, and he writes a Bible and he calls it a day. But it turns out that when you do a little bit of an interrogation of that framework, you notice that, well, for one, the printing press isn't inherent, like the creation of the Bible is just a marketing thing for Gutenberg to create the printing press, but that the creation of the printing press is a result of this combined technological and socio-political society that is there. Right? It's a society that's based on financing. The fact that Gutenberg can create the printing press owes as much to the fact that he could go and take out a business loan, which was a new thing, than anything about the art of writing. It also was tied up in the fact that the church was selling indulgences at that time. And so, it took monks a really long time to write out all of the indulgences. And if you're the Catholic Church and you want to be selling those things by the boatload, it really helps to have someone who can just run off a whole pile of them all at once. So the technology is always and inherently part of this generalized context, this contextual form. And so, understanding the importance and impact of digital data means trying to understand its milieu. The ways, the contexts in which it operates, and the collection of both scientific and technological and social and political formulations that are operating. And so one of the primary ways to get at this is the idea of data's flexibility. We talked about this a little bit last time. We talked about how data is inherently flexible, which allows it to be reformulated and recombined in a multitude of different ways to suit different purposes, right? This is you guys are my little crew of data scientists over here, they're saying like, this is how you learn how to do it, right? You get handed a sample data set and you're asked to run different sort of statistical tests or modeling, or you're doing things on this sample data that maybe you know where it comes from, maybe you don't, right? You say, okay, we collected this data for this purpose, but it can also be put to use doing something else. Because at the end of the day, it's this collection of numbers in a grid, and that is flexible and helpful. And so I think one of the things when we're trying to understand digital data in the milieu formulation that happens here, say, okay, that milieu is defined by flexibility. The ability that you can transfer data from one place to the other. And so, what I want to say here is that digital data then becomes a categorical description. It's a collection of information as binary code inside of a storage medium. And that means, this is perhaps my most bold claim, but I'm going to make it boldly and we'll go from there. Is that there's no truth in data. That what you get when you do data analysis is you get arguments about the world, not truth. This is because, as might be familiar, any particular data set can be interpreted in a near infinite number of ways. Data can be sliced, it can be cleaned, it can be weighed, it can be interpreted to support a wide variety of hypotheses and conclusions, and it is almost infinitely malleable in that way. And in fact, if it wasn't so infinitely malleable, it would not be useful to us as a technological form. Right? If you could only use the data for the exact purpose that you collected it, an entire industry wouldn't exist. There's an industry of data brokers. What are data brokers?
People that sell data.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like people or organizations that make their entire sort of business careers around collecting data in different places in different forms, packaging it all together, and selling it to companies or to other places to use for advertising. We talked about political data last time, about like how political campaigns want to collect so much data to help mobilize voters. Where do they get that data from? Data brokers.
Yeah. Isn't it also like limited by the language?
In what way?
Like you say, data says there are 50 tigers in a zoo, and it's like, how many tigers are there? And
limited by the, yeah, I mean, I think limited by the context in which the data is operating. But I think the idea of, can you use the fact that there are 50 tigers in the zoo to tell me something about the world, is that point of flexibility. That I could say, okay, that when a zoo has more tigers, more people want to see the zoo, so therefore people like tigers.
okay, yeah.
Right? That's the flexibility. That's the malleability about that.
Stefan?
Yeah.
One question. I can remember if it was a book or an article, I think, I can remember reading if we talked directly about this last class, that says raw data is an oxymoron.
Yeah. That's the Rita Rayleigh. The reason why it's a very it's in an edited volume.
And then it's about it.
Yeah.
Raw data is.
I remember because I had to pay a pile of money to get access to that edited volume. Yeah. So there's a phrase that the idea that raw data is an oxymoron. So there in perhaps in your statistics class, you like, oh, you take what is seemingly raw data and you turn it into something that is usable by either by cleaning it, by making sure everything works, or by adapting it for your particular uses, or doing these sorts of things. And the argument of this text is that that choice is always made. That there's no point where data, in terms of data collection, is a thing that happens without like intentional choice. You're making a choice always about what the data is, how it's collected, and what it looks like. So to come back to, I'll use an example coming ahead. I was going to try to squeeze the tiger example in there, but I don't know if I can do that easily without stretching the brain too much. But like, think about a survey, right? You do survey research for any number of reasons, like that's the backbone of social science. It might be, you might say that, okay, I've done a survey and I have all of these responses, that's raw data that I can then use to come up with an analysis or come up with a some sort of conclusion based on that. But the argument of this raw data being an oxymoron is that no, there was always an act of creation that happened, right? If you made the survey, you had to design the survey. You had to write the questions. You had to write the ways in which those questions are answered. It comes back to even Colin Koopman's idea of formatting too, because, okay, am I asking you a yes or no question? Or am I asking you a question where you rank it out of 10? Or like a Likert scale where it's like most likely, somewhat likely, not likely at all, like the sort of different options. How am I presenting your options to you when you're taking the survey? The idea of there not being truth in data and that raw data is an oxymoron is saying that all of those things are intentional choices that you're making when you're doing these things. And this is even true for like passive data collection, right? If you're collecting data about things that are either observationally or you're scraping data from the internet, like it always involves inherent decisions. And that means that it can work this way. It's always part of the interpretation. And without any, and to sort of put it on the other end of that, without any context or interpolation, the meaning of a set of entries is sort of as meaningless as a single entry, right? That you can't get any information out of data if it's purely numbers, right? You could run a statistical analysis on a data set, but without knowing what that data set is about, your results don't tell me anything about the world. You with me?
Yeah, you need to analyze it.
What? You need to analyze it,
yeah.
But the analytic, when we say the analysis, we're often talking about like, oh, I'm doing statistics on it, right?
Maybe.
But also those statistics have to be in relation to something in the world.
Yeah, context.
Context. And because of that, data is flexible, and that is why I want to take my bold argument and make it bolder, and to say that data, because of its inherent flexibility, because there's no truth in data, I'll put this back over here, data is post-structural. Now, to explain this concept, unfortunately, we have to return to the French. But this is one of my core arguments that helps solve this problem also, right? By claiming that what we're interested in is in this milieu, this connection between the scientific and the technological, we have to sort of free ourselves from the idea that we're accessing something like truth, that there are clear and inherent answers to these types of questions. I'm going to ask this as a very loaded question, and then I will explain it. What's post-structuralism? Does anybody know? How much advanced philosophy have you had access to? Not enough.
Not much. Engineers and data scientists, economists as well. So.
Not a lot of Derrida in your lives? So, here's what, basically, post-structuralism, and this is a simplification of this definition, because through things like deconstructionist methods that you find in Derrida, or like genealogies that you find in Foucault, is an idea or an approach that embraces contingent forms of knowledge that are embedded in their social and political context. Basically, post-structuralism is I will say this as my sort of standard way, and then we'll go back and explain it. Post-structuralism is an epistemological framing that posits a vision of truth based on argumentation and interpretation rather than a structural epistemological foundation. I use the word epistemology twice in there. Epistemology is just the philosophical study of knowledge and knowing. So the question here is, how do we know things? In what ways do we know things? And is there a way to know something in a truly objective way? A structural, so post-structural is in contrast to structural, or even in the way that it's also sometimes called postmodern in the sort of contrast to modernist thinking. Structural and modernist, I'm squishing a bunch of things together here. But basically the idea of a structuralist or a modernist interpretation is that there is a sort of existing structural way of understanding the world that gives us access to real objective truth. Usually through things like a logical inductive method that allows us to sort of build out true knowledge about the world. In many ways, a traditional scientific, this is why people who are into the hard sciences really bristle at post-structural or postmodernist thinking, because one of the ways to think about scientific understandings is that it is a structural form of knowing. If you follow the scientific method, if you do the steps, you come to real, actionable, objective knowledge about the world. That's the idea, right? You run tests, you run sort of blind peer-reviewed studies, you do these things and you come to pure objective knowledge. Post-structuralism, postmodernism challenges this idea. And the challenge of this idea is to not say that nothing matters, or nothing is real, or nothing works. A lot of the pushback or criticism you get when you talk about sort of post-structuralism and postmodernism is the idea of well, you don't believe anything works, and yet you got in an airplane that's based on science and that flew you across the world to get here. Yes, but the idea is instead that what we're doing is always rooted in argumentation and interpretation, rather than finding some sort of objective understanding of the world. That everything that we engage with, the only actual capacity we have to engage in the world is through something like argumentation and interpretation. It's always going to be interpreting things. It's always going to be arguing for things. And we have created sort of institutions that sort of formalize the arguments, but this is why something like a scientific method to a postmodern or post-structuralist would be a socially agreed upon methodology, a set of argumentations that get us to a socially acceptable conclusion. Are you with me?
Yep.
I don't believe you. There's a lot of very... And I will say this is a contingent definition. A lot of this comes out of aesthetics and the study of art and the study of textualism. One of the big things, Derrida's big move inside of this method is to say when we're reading a text, there's no true way of reading a text. There's only ever arguments. You can never know what a book or a novel or anything really truly means because there's no true core of a book or of understanding there. Even the author themselves doesn't really know what the true meaning of it is. They in the act of writing are opening it up to interpretation in all of these different ways. And so it comes through aesthetics, same thing with art and other sorts of structures. But it has a really social political formulation of saying that one of the things that we can grapple with is this idea that our engagement with the world is argumentative. Right? It's argument all the way down. And so, the result of this is that I think that we live in a post-structural world that is then used and inhabited by post-structural technologies. So part of this, why we do the milieu first and then the post-structuralism second, is that the milieu is reflective of the world that we live in. And so data's inherent flexibility reflects a world in flux as well. And so the argument that I'm making here is that there's a post-structuralist position that is sort of the default accepted position in our world today, right? It should be understood that this post-structural position is embraced sort of universally in politics, even by the right and the left. This used to be a leftist critical project, and a lot of the problems with trying to apply it to the modern era and to things that are happening in the world is that all of the canonical thinkers who are doing this, Foucault, Derrida, all of these folks, they are all positioning it as a critique against a hegemonic structuralism. Right? We have good forms of art that tell us things about the world. We have solid understandings. What we're finding is we're finding objective truth, right? This is the to make it like the most caricatured, imagine I'm going to use American examples because welcome to me, is like, imagine like 1950s Americana, right? Of like, we are the defenders of truth and liberty in the American way against the communist nations in the Cold War, right? A structuralist hegemonic understanding against which these thinkers, these Derrida and whatnot, are pushing the critique from the left. And so, it's hard because they're positioning themselves as being this countervailing point. But today, it seems like this positionality that is argument all the way down is sort of more universally accepted. And I think this is especially true in the West and the United States. Right? One of the things, there's a very interesting book that was just written about this, that makes the argument that the right in the United States has embraced postmodernism more than the left has, even though it was originally a leftist project. The idea of like fake news and living in a post-truth society and misinformation and mass polarization and all of these sort of mechanisms for pushing alternative interpretations of seemingly settled understandings or settled ways of thinking about the world. Matthew McManus, the author of this book, argues that post-structuralism has become the playing field of both the left and the right. And so, by positing the milieu, I want to say that the flexibility of data is both reflecting and reinforcing this overarching social idea. Right? That's why it was so important for me to make this claim initially. The claim that, though, do we create technology or does technology create us is a problematic claim, because if we didn't understand that the problematic nature of that claim first, it would be hard to say that the post-structuralism makes any sense. Right? We have to say that no, the technology and the society go hand in hand. The reason we live in a post-structural society is in part because we have a post-structuralist technology, but also the reason we have a post-structuralist technology is because we have a post-structuralist society. These things are built together. Right? And I mean, this happens all of the time. There's another text by Orrit Halpern who identifies that there's a post-structuralism at the core of AI systems, especially in large language models. And this is the quote that she makes. It says, "They are a system that no longer seeks primary reference in the world, but assumes truth as agreement within optimization processes that can include adversarial components." The idea of establishing a ground truth in a large language model or in an interpretive model is the idea of recognizing that the truth is actually in the argumentation, and that you're building out your system from that core assumption. That truth is whatever I say it is. Also, I'm going to freestyle a quote here. This is also why Louisa Moore talks about ground truth, and why she makes the argument that we talk about AI models hallucinating. We talk about them, and when they are incorrect, they are creating hallucinations. Moore argues that this is wrong, that this is incorrect, because they're not hallucinating. They're operating off of the ground truth that was provided to them. They're operating exactly as designed. They're just outside, I would say they are just outside of the milieu in which they are appropriate. It's like the clock. When an LLM hallucinates, it's like you plugged the clock into the wrong plug, right? It's not that it's operating incorrectly. It's not like the internal mechanisms are messed up. It's that we have established a separate context for it. And that's the problem. Which in many ways is a more foundational problem than saying, oh, it's just making up things about the world. Right? When an AI can't tell you the number of, the number of R's in the word strawberry. Do you remember this? Or like there's a while there where if you ask ChatGPT how many R's were in the word strawberry, it would say 2. That hallucination is caused not because the system is working exactly as planned, it's just in a different context. Yeah?
When you said there's no truth in data, and connecting it to the fact that you predict that technology is shaped by its milieu, and you said there is no raw data, because collection of data is a filter in and out of itself.
Yeah.
Then would you say data is technology?
I think that is the core of my entire project.
Because data is technology.
Yeah, I want to.
Influenced by its society, and the truth is basically decided by the society itself.
Yeah.
Not from data.
Yes.
Okay.
I want to say that this entire project is based on the argument, I will say, not the assumption, the argument that data itself is and should be understood as a technology rather than something else like the raw, raw. Because I think you were talking about the Zuboff book, right? The core problem I have with the Zuboff book is, so this is The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, one of the sort of foundational texts that brings this to the fore. One of the problems I have with this book is she describes data like mining, right? One of her core metaphors. So this is a book about how Google uses data as the core of its business, and that it's sort of mostly a business history book where it spins off how the story of Google spins off from providing search and selling the search engine as a useful thing to developing and selling advertisements as its core practice, which requires all of this surveillance, right? Freestyle this book real quick. Initially, Google made all of its money by selling access to its search engine to other companies. So Yahoo bought access to the Google search engine so that when you went to the Yahoo's homepage, it would have Google search embedded in it. Or when you open up your browser, and I mean, we all use Chrome now, it's owned by Google, but if you open up Safari or something and it has Google as its default search engine, Apple pays Google for the right to do that. And that was originally Google's business model. We create this really good search engine and we sell it to companies that want to use it as a way of getting access to consumers. And then the Zuboff book is saying, actually, in doing this, they discovered that, hey, we're getting all of this information about people, and we can use it instead to sell advertisements, and that can become the core of our business. And that's the story. But the problem I have with this book is that she describes the collection of this data as they were able to find this sort of natural resource that was going unused and then turn it into this sort of massive empire, right? She even calls it like detritus, that it was this like extra thing, this surplus that wasn't being used, and now they took this thing that they were throwing away and now turning it into a stuff, right? So the logic that's there is that is sort of out in the world, right? There's even another phrase that people used to use where they call data the new oil. Data's the new oil. All of which are reinforcing this idea that it is a resource to harvest and to use in these particular ways. I know I went on a long tangent to get away from that question you asked. But so I think that is a way that a lot of people try to understand data. And I want to say, no, data itself is a technological force. Data itself is a technology. It's not a resource. It's not a raw information. It's not like oil. And when we understand, because if we only understand it like oil, we can't, it doesn't fit in this sort of framework. We can't do this type of investigation. We can't say, well, how is it impacting society? Instead, by understanding it as a technology in its own right, now we can start to interrogate it in the ways that I've been wanting to do. Does that?
Yeah, it's like much more relevant now that there are like machine learning models that actually like feed from data.
Yeah, or like create their own data in the process of doing these things. Yeah, I think it's all part of that, right? I think the danger is, one of the other dangers, especially with like machine learning models and things like that, say, oh, if that's the technology, then we lose the fact that they're reliant on this other technology that is somehow, that is even more foundational. That's sort of my argument. Other questions? How are we doing?
Yeah, I mean, you're using data, you're referring data to technology, saying data is technology, but at the same time, it's very different to all the examples of technology we used.
That's the challenge, I think, right? And I think I will have you hold on to that thought a little bit.
Also, you said no truth in data, and it's like, is there a truth in the other technologies? Does that question even make sense?
I think that's my point, right? Is that I think we when we say that there's truth in data, we are doing this inappropriate like equivocation that I think is why it doesn't work. I think that's sort of the point, is what I tried to make, right? Is by saying there's no truth in data. It's like this is a category error we are making.
Right. Yeah.
But there's an irony here, because despite this, despite the whole framing, data seems to exist at the core of positivistic social science, or positivistic science at all, right? Positivistic science being the sort of antithesis of post-structuralism, right? The idea of finding truth in data. If you talk to, I know social science more than like data science folks, but I'd be interested to see if this is true, is like if you talk to social scientists who do a lot of quantitative research, and I'm not taking, I know we talk a lot about quantitative, but I'm taking a couple of swings at quantitative folks here. If you talk to, especially quantitative social scientists, they will talk as if they have like gotten to the truth of a thing through using quantitative statistical methods, right? I know how people operate because I've done these surveys or because I've made these sort of frameworks. And so data is sort of nominally used as a like structural justification in itself for these types of knowledge claims. But the reality is that it's the interpretation that's at the core of this existence. That data reflects this, especially digital data, and its interpretive frameworks. And that's why I want to resist this framework, this sort of data as resource framing, data as framing, because the slipperiness of the conversation means that we end up with conclusions that don't make sense or are overstated, right? This is why you see, for example, in the same, I see this all of the time in political science work. I mean, you might start to see this if you look at it. You will notice that in the same paper, people will talk extensively about the statistical methodologies that they used, the confidence intervals that they used, the error terms, how they accounted for error, and then in their discussion section, talk about what kind of real, true understandings they came to about the world. Where, like, paragraphs earlier, they're like, we're not fully sure this is real because I did the statistics about it and all statistics has error. Like, I'm sure at a 95% confidence interval that this is true. That's not a truth claim. That's an argument. Now, we might say that's a good argument. And I'm not saying that it's not a useful argument. But I'm saying that it is a categorically different thing than saying I have access to truth. And yet, we're slippery in our language and our usage of it. And that's why I want to broaden this framework and say that technological forms are not mute objects, but are complex social technical milieus. Data exists only as a part of the society that it helps to describe. It does not and cannot contain a form of objective truth, and it can't be totalized in the way that we might want to expect. We can't say there's a total understanding in here. I also think, just for you, that I think Simondon is wrong in his concretization argument because data cannot be concretized. Sidebar, just travel. Since you mentioned you knew so.
But Stefan, so you are basically, at this point, making an epistemological claim,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
That, I mean, yeah, we are creating data that is itself a technology, a post-structural technology, but it is not a portal, a path towards real reality.
Yes.
It's just this reflection of our social context and cultural context that creates this way of relating to the world that can always be otherwise.
Yes.
It can be otherwise.
And I think this is, I think this is a good part of exploration, right? I think one of the things that has happened to us recently is the idea that the only way to relate to the world is through a data-driven way. Right? We talked about it a little bit, or we talked a little bit about the understanding of like health data and the idea of like quantifying our own health. Last class a little bit, we talked about pedometers and the idea of 10,000 steps and this, that our technologies sort of know us better than we know ourselves. And I think that's a really good example of this idea that we're talking about a relation to ourselves that is omitting other ways of relating to ourselves, right? Because this, like pedometer, but there's an entire movement. Is anyone familiar with it? It's an entire movement called the quantified self movement. It's the idea that like the way to like it sort of has bled into like the idea of like optimization of your life a little bit, right? That you can optimize your life by appealing to data and these things. The other one that comes out a lot is like sleep trackers, right? Where like it'll track, there's all of these technological things that will like track your sleep and tell you how well you slept and like do all of this analysis to be like, oh, here's sort of the patterns of how you are sleeping. Are you familiar with these at all?
Yeah.
My favorite one of these is like there was an advertisement for this where someone was like, probably on a podcast or something, but they were like talking about like selling this and being like, yeah, you can do this, and then in the morning it'll like compare your sleep to like your child's sleep, and you can tell how well you're sleeping versus your child. It's like, I have a 2-year-old. I know I'm sleeping worse than her. Like, I don't need you to tell me this because she's 2 and I have to wake up every time she wakes up. And so this is the idea, right? Is there's an argument that the only way you can come to truth is through data. The only way you can know if you had a good night's sleep or not as if there's data collected about how long your REM cycle was, and when you went to bed, and how much you moved around, and all of these things. But of course, that's not the only way to know these things, right? Because it's ignoring our subjective understandings. The best way you know about whether or not you got a good night's sleep is how you feel when you wake up. And so the argument, to make this as this epistemological argument, the argument here is that the best way, or the only way to know, is through this data, which necessarily cuts off other forms of learning, or other forms of knowing. And so it's not, and so I want to be sort of clear about this, I'm not arguing that this can't give us anything useful. I am arguing that it is not the exclusive way of knowing things. And that and this is a problem because when we treat it as being the exclusive way to know things, now we've given it a form of power. And we've given the people who control and manage this data a set of outsized power over the world and over our lives. Does that make sense? Does that move? Because if you say, okay, the best way to know things about the world, the best way to have an understanding about the world is through data. And if you make the argument that I'm not making, but if you make this straw man argument that data gives us truth, and in fact data gives us more or better truth about the world than any other form, if you make that claim, what you're also doing is inherently saying that those who have access to more data or better data have access to more or better truth. They know things about the world better than those who don't have access to it. And from there, you say, okay, well, those who know better should have more control than those who know less or know worse. And that turns out to be an inherently undemocratic thing to say. Because the idea of democracy is the idea that we all have the same access to truth, and therefore can all share in the practice of politics because we all have equal access to understanding, to knowledge, to politics. Instead, if you say, no, I have access to a form of knowledge that you are unable to get, say, well, I should have more control over politics. That's why it leads to this technocratic vision. To say that, if I know what we should do, because I have access to this data, that gives me a truth that you don't have access to, then I should be in charge. It leads us, ironically, all the way back to Plato and the idea of the philosopher king. For Plato, the philosopher should be king, should have ultimate dictatorial control over the city, because only the philosopher has real knowledge about the world and what is good. That's the point of the metaphor of the cave.
But there he's talking about the perfect man.
What?
He's talking about a perfect ruler, the perfect man that will only do good and only.
Yes, but that it is important for Plato that the development of this perfect man, not necessarily perfect man, it is a man who has access to perfect knowledge. And that access to perfect knowledge only is accessible to the philosopher who has dedicated their life to the pursuit of philosophy. And that is why they should be in charge, because only they know what the good is. And so only they can shape this society to follow this good. And that this shaping of the society means having ultimate control over everybody's life. And in many ways, lying to them. It's called the noble lie in Plato for a reason. Because you have to lie to people to make them follow what is ultimately good for them. It's why Plato is not a democratic thinker. He's an autocrat. He's in favor of dictatorship. This is the big hot take about Plato. He's actually like in favor of dictatorship. And I think that there's a slippery... What?
I was going to say that Karl Popper would agree with you with that.
Yeah. Right? I mean, I don't think that's a super controversial take about Plato. It's the core of the Republic. The core of the Republic is republics are bad. But anyway, the idea here is that when you do this, you're giving outsized political power. And you see this. This is not lost on those who control data. There's a reason why Google and the founders of Google, like Sergey Brin, went in front of the US government and said, you can't regulate me because I know more than you. It is impossible to regulate us because you are so far behind us in knowledge that you couldn't possibly. Now, David Gray points out that this is contradictory because he's saying, on the one hand, you can't possibly regulate us, but if you try, we are so fragile you will destroy us. Which is a contradictory statement. Either you're so powerful that the government can't control you, or you're so weak that the government, if they do anything, will destroy your company. But they're not. They're instrumental thinkers at best. But that's the idea. And so you see this, and so the problem the reason that I'm spending so much time framing out this question about post-structuralism is it is necessary to remove the inherent political domination that results from this idea of excessive knowledge. Are you with me? You look very skeptical.
Yes, the thing is, I don't think it's if I'm making kind of a relationship with the post-structural idea, but to what extent does the statement there is no truth in data is significant? Because if we consider that we can get to a certain kind of truth, let's say through argumenting and interpretation, I think in today's world it's independent whether or not there is truth in data, but people associate data with truth. So I don't think that the political power that data has, it's totally attributed by people. Like, I don't know if I'm making sense, but
yeah, I think I get that the political power of data is not. Let me see if I'm following you here. And correct me if I'm wrong. That the political power of data is not inherently like normal people going, "Oh, you, Mark Zuckerberg, have so much more truth than I do."
It's about the social buildup data means in our lives. It has power because it influences us.
Yes, I think that is exactly true. But I think what my point is to take that idea and to say, hey, we need to be vigilant about that idea because the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world really want us to slide into the other idea, right? They really want us to think that they have power because they have access to more knowledge. And so they're trying to base political power off of this. And then if we are saying, oh, we recognize their power because they have built up this social capacity and they have these sorts of controls, then we can start to ask the question, should they have that power? How should that power be limited and managed, right? It shifts the discussion from a technical discussion to a political discussion, which I think you're framing out, right?
Yeah, I think that the scheme you're trying to make is that we have a control of our decisions we make about the data. Because for example, Korean German thinker Bin-Cho Han, in relation with the quantified self, justifies that there has come an extent that we have built such relationship with data that we cannot separate us from it. Mm-hmm. And thus, like the new marketing self and achievement society comes out. I think that his arguments are very intertwined with what you're saying, but I think that the fact that you're framing like us separated from data and that we can ourselves make coherent or build up any coherent idea of data, that I cannot totally get to that, because I think we are in data. I don't know if that makes sense, but data is so within us that we cannot make that separation you are trying us to make, I think.
You're really gonna love tomorrow. Because you know what's coming. Is that's the art. So my argument, I think, let me see if I can clarify to get you back on board. Is I want to argue, perhaps even the opposite, that we are more intertwined than we might think, and that I even go further than that argument about us being intertwined. I think that we have a fully alternative self that happens because of our intertwining with data.
Yeah, but I think in today's world, there's no distinction between that. I mean, it's contradictory, because you say we have an alternate self, but we become that alternate self.
Yes.
Because of the achievement society, because of we want to marketingalize ourselves, and that idea is based up on data. And if there is no truth on data, how is a certain degree of truth in ourselves?
Okay, so I'm not trying to not do all of tomorrow right now, but yes, I think I call this the subatomic person, and we'll frame that out next time, exactly the correlation. But I think the argument that I'm to sort of pull it back to where I want to go, and why I think this is important as a setup to that argument, is to say that I think in a way this explains that intertwining of data and the person. That I maybe there's some question about it, but I think my goal with this framing out here is to elaborate that intertwining of data and the person as being even more interconnected than we might initially think, right? Because the idea is not to say that we are separate or we are different, but that we have to understand everything as this contextual milieu where society and the technology and our position in society and our politics is intertwined with the political structures. They're not separable. And I think one of the things that when there is arguments being made about data having this sort of connection to knowledge and connection to truth, it's trying to separate. It's actually trying to do that separation that I don't think is possible, right? Because if you're saying that data is in and of itself a natural resource or a thing that has truth, you're separating it from society and you're putting it over there and saying we need access to this thing in order to bring it back into society, right? I think that's the argument that tends to be made by both those who have lots of control over data and some people who are doing this analysis of data itself, right? I think this is the problem I have with the Zuboff text, is that it is doing that work. And so of trying to make that separation nice and clean and say, actually it's over here. But I want to bring it all together because I think it's so intertwined with our lives. I think that's why this context and this post-structuralism is so important. Because the post-structuralist point is to say that we too are made up of these arguments. We understand ourselves through this sort of contextual, argumentative structure. We exist as part of this milieu ourselves, right? We understand ourselves as being an intertwining of technological and social forces, right? We see ourselves as having this sort of intertwining nature of data. We think the way we think because of our technological framework. So I think I'm in agreement with you. I think my grappling with Dr. Han is a little, I don't know if I think super interesting, but I think that might just be me. And
he's huge.
Yeah, I know. I went into a bookstore. I went to a bookstore today and I was like, he's everywhere. What's going on? And I think he's a little less prevalent in the States.
Yeah.
I think part of it is like he writes these really short pieces,
Yeah.
these really short books that like I read them. I'm like, okay, where's the argument? It's over. Like I see where you're going, and then nothing interesting happened.
Once you read 5 of those, you start.
You start to see. I guess maybe I haven't gone fully into it, but because I read his quantified self thing, and I was like, wait, this is just Wendy Chung's argument, who wrote books about the quantified self movement.
But he's a good businessman, you see.
Yeah, he's very. I know you gotta learn how to do it. Yeah, if you write like 15 little books, it's better than one big book. I know. It's the way to do it, man.
Is your
little
book
pamphlets.
is your book very long?
My book's gonna be so long.
You're just in time, you can publish it by chapters.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
true. I gotta find someone who will accept it.
Just volume 1, 2, 3, 4.
So does that sort of get at that point that I'm trying to make?
I think so.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I want to be more cognizant of, or more sort of targeted, is the political valences that happen when that is, right? That I think one of the things that I want to say when we get into this part and the subatomic part is that there's a real changing of politics here, and a reformation of the ways we think about ourselves as having the capacity to participate in politics.
Well, I think the idea or the thesis is very similar to, for example, Johan's psychopolitics.
Yeah.
That's why
That's the one I'm most familiar with.
Yeah, when I read the first page of your book that he sent to us, you spoke about Foucault's biopolitics.
Yeah.
And it felt like weird that you used that notion of biopolitics, which is tied to the whole idea of a disciplinary society. And it felt weird that you didn't even mention Byung-Chul Han's idea, because he's been developing the idea of psychopolitics and more of an achievement society for more than a decade. And I think that your argument is pretty similar to his. But although the two of you are justifying it completely different and with very different focuses,
Yeah.
I think that the thesis itself, it's quite similar. And I think, like a personal comment, that your theory could be enriched by.
I will say, I'll agree. He has been on my list to go back to, and I'll have to go back to the so I read the psychopolitics book a while ago, and I have not gone back to it.
And the Koopman guide about info power, where Byung-Chul has infocracy, which yesterday with the whole thing you were talking about, like that book was in my mind. You know, the whole idea that to what extent does data influence us in a political way? I think that he has a very interesting focus on that.
Yeah, I'll have to take that. I take that push usefully. I think that is the framework. All right. So other. Get back to.
Can I say something?
Yeah. While I find out where I am in my place, because I was looking for a quote for you that I didn't find.
Popped up in my head, right? It's like, so when we're talking about this lack of truth in data, right, it reminds me of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle in a way, right? Like we are creating the world in which we live at the same time. It's kind of a, like a circle. You know what I mean? And he has this. Well, his famous quote is that with science, man encountered himself, right? So it's not accessing a truth beyond itself because of the uncertainty principle.
Yeah.
Right? And it's like when we use tools in order to try to know the world, we actually changing the world that we're trying to know at the same time. So there's no, like, we cannot go beyond the tools that we use in order to understand the world. And I think connecting that with our use of data.
Yeah, I think that's true. That this is a sort of mutually reinforcing structure, right? Yeah, I have a whole thing about. We'll skip the Foucault and Marcuse a bit, but if you want me to talk about either of those people, I'll talk about them forever. I think one of the things that this does is this helps us interrogate the idea of progress as a technological force. I think one of the other subcurrents here that I want to sort of problematize through this discussion of the milieu and the social technology, even maybe against this Popperian idea that you brought up a little bit earlier, is like, does technology support progress? And what do we mean by this claim? I think the problem is that we think about technology as something that progresses forward through time, that we are making particular like advancements, and but I think that the progressive nature of technological development, especially as it is in relation to data, is like theoretically underdetermined, right? It seems like we want to say that technology always makes our life better, but it's worth interrogating that claim. That it's worth sort of interrogating what we mean by making our life better, what it means to sort of structure these things in relationship to progress. But to sort of sum this up is basically to say that if we think of technology as having this like metaphysical core, we end up making value determinations as if they were the truth and using them to make moral claims on those outside of it. And so the idea here is if we think about technology as playing a role in a grand theory of history, right? This is sort of me engaging with and pushing back with this sort of Marxist vision, but it pops up all over the place when we're talking about technology, is that like technology is progressive in this sort of grand historical like normative framework. It makes our lives better, it continues sort of unabated, and one of the arguments for this, or one of the motivations behind this question of do we create technology or does it create us, is to try to figure out what the driving force of this sort of historical move, this grand history of moving forward truly is. I don't think that this is inherently true in the way that we think it is. I'm not trying to say that our lives aren't made more efficient or more comfortable or other things like that. I'm just trying to interrogate this question of what advancement means. And I think that this is especially true for data, because the fuzzy sort of multivalent nature of data means that the advancements that we might see only actually make data more available for other purposes. But there are social and political structures embedded in this, and that's true for other technologies as well. I think the thing that I'm resisting is another sort of counterpoint, is that when we say that technology is associated with the idea of progress, it's a way of deepening the separation, the theoretical separation between the scientific and technological and the social and the political. Right? That when we make the argument, or maybe not we, when people make the argument that if you are criticizing technology, you are being anti-progress. This is something that I tend to run into occasionally, is like, oh, you are critical of AI, you're critical of data, you are you're interrogating all of these problems and you're saying why it's bad and what you should and shouldn't be doing. You are anti-progress, you're against these things. And I think what's really going on here is that there's this intellectual division that's trying to be made between the scientific, the technological, and the social and the political. And saying that, oh, there's problems here, or saying that these two things are related, is a way of trying to resist that move, right? And so, like, the argument I want to make is that all of these technologies are inherently intertwined, right? The prospect of an atomic age shaped social structures, government action, it shaped pop culture, with emanations that are still visible today. I think what happens is that these developments, both in scholarships around industrial automation, the cultural importance of the atomic bomb, they all present specific visions of progress. So it's not that there's a singular progress, but there are visions of what it means to project into the future based on the technology, right? There's this technological futurism that is embedded in our social and political frameworks, right? So in the terms around industrial automation and the atomic bomb, this vision of progress is characterized by the domination and plunder of the natural world, or a democratic hegemony driven by the access to sort of technological future promised by the atomic age. But these visions of progress, while projections into the future, nevertheless hold a form of social power that's unique to the technologies. So instead of saying, hey, you are that I'm anti-progress, or that there's a vision of progress, instead there's like multiple there's like multiple conceptions of progress that are tied up in these things. I just keep running.
So this,
Ah.
okay, that works perfect.
Yeah. There's multiple forms of progress that come out of our visions of what the future is, right? So the argument here is that we're projecting into the future our visions of what could be, and we're basing that off of the form of life or the technological development that we have. So to say that I'm anti-progress, or to say that, oh, this progress is inevitable, is to sort of be making a decision between a number of multiple forms and saying, oh, this is the real one, versus recognizing its sort of multiplicity. And I think data is no exception to this, right? As a hegemonic technological form, as a technology, it wields a large influence about what we think is possible, on what we might call our collective future imaginaries. What could happen? Right? I think we see this a lot in AI, right? There's a philosopher, Shannon Valor, who talks about this, who says that AI is a form of, she calls it temporal structuring, in her quote, where AI is built to conserve the patterns of the past and extend them into our future. The idea is that what we're doing when we're saying, oh, AI is the future, is we are making a decision about which form of progress is canonical, is the one that we want to have. Right? This goes back to my initial claim about like path dependencies, is that we're making all of these decisions that are putting us on these paths that have political, social, and technological outcomes. And that's why the discussion we had of friction last week is really important. Let's see. All right, I'll make one more claim, and then I want to talk about some stuff. So what happens as a result of a number of these things, the questions of political power that get brought in together? What's the harm? What's the problem? What's the issue at work here? And I think one of the ways that we can try to see this, and I'm setting up what we'll talk about tomorrow, is a form of alienation. Why do we go through this idea of data and the conception of progress is because I think the primary political impact that data has on society comes in the form of what we might call an alienation of the self. That it's an alienation of the self that is tied to a Western progressivistic vision of society that can do things like replicate colonial logic and reduce the individual into what I will call the subatomic person. And what this does is it helps us try to understand the causal frameworks under which data develops political power. The goal here is to try to come up with a theory of data as a political object, as a technology that has a political that acts as a political object in order to interrogate what the outcome of those politics are. And the goal, or the argument I want to say, is that the outcome of these politics is a unique form of alienation that's at the core of data. And what that does is it removes our ability to participate in politics. And so, by doing this, we can recognize the alienating elements of data as an inherent part of data itself as a technology. And that no application of data for good or an intentional use of data can mitigate this. That alienation as a structure is a part of modern late industrial society that's embedded in everything we do, from our media consumption to our labor. But importantly, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't use data. The goal here is not to say that because data is alienating in this way, and I'll put a little, this is tomorrow. If you're wondering now, what do I mean by the alienation of the self? The alienation of the self from the self. We'll get to that tomorrow, but I want to posit the setup to this. Because I want to say, the issue is not that, alienation is an inherent problem, and that means we shouldn't use data, or that data is incompatible with our lives. I'm instead trying to say that this harm here is part of our society. And so a proper understanding might, if a bit counterintuitively, help ameliorate our current conditions.
I just wanted to ask you maybe if you can give a little taste of what you mean by alienation, because it may be not clear to everybody. I mean, for us, it's just our second nature, so like Marx alienation, but maybe what do you mean by?
Yeah. So all right. Let me see if I can. You can jump in if I'm going too off the rails here a little bit. But alienation, in Marx, alienation is what happens when you are separated from an inherently human action. He frames this in terms of labor, right? There's an inherently human action of creation that happens when we create something, we put a part of ourselves into it, and so it reflects us in a way, right? If you imagine the way that Marx frames it is a hunter-gatherer society, and you make pottery, you are putting yourself into that pottery, and it is a reflection of yourself, and so you have this attachment to the things that you do. For Marx, we're fundamentally creative, a creative species. We create things. That's our species being. And so when that gets turned into mechanical labor, where instead of building something and putting yourself into it and having it as a reflection of yourself, you're working on an assembly line, pressing a button, or screwing one part of a widget into another, then you're losing a part of what it means to be human. Because you're no longer able to fulfill that reflective human action of creation. So that's the term alienation gets tended to use. I'm sort of taking that idea, bringing it into a modern technological age, and tying it to this idea of politics, in that we are losing the connection to who we are, in particular, the idea that we are individuals who can understand ourselves and act in a political way. Okay? That is an inherent part of who we are, and that we are losing part of that, or we are being separated from part of that through this technological process of being subject to data, this intertwining of data as a technology and a person, sort of, despite the intertwining, is actually separating us from who we truly are. And so that is this idea of the alienation of the self. And I think that's a major political problem that we have. But like I said, I think we live in a society that is sort of shot through with alienation of different forms. I think there's lots of arguments about, people have written a lot about the alienation of modern labor, right? Even today, even in a society that is less tied to labor as labor, or like you go and you sit in an office and you work on spreadsheets all day, like there's an alienation in that because you're not creating anything useful, right? There's a whole genre of people who complain that their entire job is creating PowerPoints that nobody like looks at, right? And like they're describing alienation, right? They're creating something that doesn't matter, and that has this sort of relationship of alienation here. And so the argument is not that data is uniquely problematic and must be sort of excised from our society because of its alienation, but that we need to recognize that it is not outside of this alienating tendencies of all of our society. And part of the issue here is that despite the large amount of scholarship and imaginary on both the specific harms and the biases of digital technology, as well as the imagination to the attempt to imagine what could be different, data remains a problem embedded with our daily lives, right? I would say, I don't know, maybe you would, I would say the beginning of the modern era of scholarship on digital technology begins probably in like 2015. That's where it really like picks up. The Zuboff book comes, I think it's a 2018 book, but you get Sophia Noble's book in about 2015. You get all of the early work on the biases and harms of technology and data in our modern era out there. So it's like, we've been doing this for a decade at this point, and not much has changed. Why is that? Why haven't we been successful at solving this problem? I think one of the issues here is because we keep dealing with surface level harms. We keep dealing with the biases, the questions of like specific harms, rather than understanding data in itself. And so we can't separate technology from the political and social forces at work. And so people tend to assume that the problem with technology can either be solved through the development of new and revolutionary technologies, or that they can be addressed exclusively from the position of society. This is why, again, I think this is the most important division that needs to be contested. And I think you see this with AI, right? How do we solve established problems with AI? Like, we were talking about the water usage problem and how it's sort of mythological and sort of not mythological last time. Like, how do we grapple with that problem? Well, there's one answer that's specifically technological, right? We make less resource-intensive artificial intelligence structures. We make chips that require less electricity usage or require less cooling. But what I think the problem with that is that it's trying too hard to separate these two things. Really the question here is not actually about water usage, but it's about how much we would like to have our technical systems determine our social and political futures. Right? The question is not, oh, it's using too much electricity, oh, it's using too much water. It's like, no, given the limited resources that we have, what do we want to allocate our resources to? And in many ways, it feels like we don't have control over that question anymore. And it's the same for problems like bias, right? We're expecting technical solutions to happen on their own. We are assuming that technological developments tend to happen in a vacuum and are unaffected by the social and political forces at work in broader societies. Right? Expecting an AI system to not function as an extension of the profit-seeking motives of the major AI companies is to be a utopianist. Right? To say, oh, the problem with AI is that we'll solve the problem of AI in the future, which is to say that in some ways AI will solve capitalism, and then we'll cease to be worried about AI making money for people. Like, I think what we have to do is, like, one of my sort of critiques or frames is like, I'm not interested in doing this utopian theory. I want to grapple with this real world where these things are connected. That you can't talk about the future of AI without talking about the real social and political motivations that are behind it. You can't talk about AI as a future technology as if it's not tied to a corporation whose primary interest is in making as much money as possible. I think if you want to know about AI and the future of AI in the next 6 to 12 months, the most important thing you could learn about right now is the intricacies of the US stock market and the IPO offerings. Because that is the most important thing to talk about where the next AI technological development is happening, is the fact that all of them are paranoid that they will lose money if they go public in the US stock market. Because that's what happened to SpaceX.
Isn't there like an AI bubble?
That's the problem with the AI bubble. They're worried that if they go public, people will short them, and then their stock will price, and then this bubble will sort of crash because it's all based on sort of little self-dealing, right? You can't only understand AI in a purely technological sense. You have to understand it in that way also. Or even in a more direct sense. We were talking about this the other day, right? The other thing to know about AI in technological development is you're seeing so much development in large language models now because these AI companies have literally went and bought entire computer science departments. What you do, if you're a computer science professor now, you have a partnership with an AI company where no matter what your research used to be, you only work on generative models now because you get so much money from these companies. Either directly, like OpenAI will come to you if you're a computer science professor and say, do you want to make triple your salary and come work for us instead? People go, see ya. Or what is more likely to happen now is these AI companies will say, hey, I'll fund any research you want to do as long as it's useful for AI. And so it becomes an incentive for you to play ball and say, I'm going to do AI work. So it's a real problem in the field of computer science right now, is that what used to be a really wide field of varieties of research is now exclusively about generative AI work. So basically the argument is it's always a trade-off. And the idea of the milieu and this post-structuralism is to try to come up with a way of grappling with this problem in a way that is more holistic. So that's the goal of what today is. A whole lecture on trying to solve the question I asked you at the end of last week's class, or yesterday's class. Questions, concerns as of right now?
Well, I can wait to see how you connect the scientific, the social-political, and the self. The technical, the social, and the
We'll see how that works.
the political subject.
Yeah.
But it's the self.
I think this is the challenge, right? Is to say that these things, I think the answer is we live in this world, right? That we live in this world that is multiply constitutive of social and technological forces and political forces, and so we have to navigate this problem. And the outcome of this navigation is that it sort of changes our relation to how we exist in the world. Okay. I guess the question I have is more evaluative and sort of reflective in this way, which is, so the central arguments of this chapter involve reinterpreting how we see data and technology, right? This is the concept of the milieu and how it connects to the larger arguments of data and technology. and this question of post-structural data as being this question of sort of truth and fundamentally like understanding. So I guess I sort of broaden this out a little bit. I think one of the questions is like, is this argument okay, 3, in the same way that we had last time. Again, these are framing out of ways to try to grapple with or understand what we've been talking about, right? Number 1, is this argument about the milieu and the post-structural data convincing? Like, where are we going? Is this a useful way of understanding the world? And can you apply it to other technological forms? I did a little bit of this with AI, but I'm sort of interested in how it's relating to your understandings and the way that it's grappling with the world. And so to sort of bring this back around is, how are our ways of understanding the world impacted by technology? So what I want to do is sort of to have you think about, and again, you met me yesterday. You don't have to agree with anything I say. I'm happy to like deal with this pushback. Like, I think it's great. You're not going to hurt my feelings, so don't worry about that. Trust me. I have things go through peer review. You got to try way harder to hurt. You've never had your feelings hurt as somebody who's dedicated a 3,000 word streak to why everything you've ever said is dumb, to harden you against the world. So I want to see if you're finding this convincing, if this connection between the scientific, technological, and the social political is a useful understanding or a useful frame, how it might travel, how it might apply, and then to sort of bring this all together, like, how can we see our ways of understanding the world being impacted by technology? Are we understanding things about ourselves, about our politics, about the ways in which we're grappling with things change via the technologies that we're grappling with the world? And again, I would say these are motivated as being reflective questions, and I'm not going to expect you to question number 1, the answer is this. I want you to sort of interrogate these ideas, right? It's a little more loose than that, rather than an attempt to sort of do these things. I want you to just be thinking through these questions. Thoughts? Initial stabs, questions, clarifications. I know. Look, I'm interested in making you think about stuff. Welcome to political theory. It's not, you're not going to get problem sets or whatever it is that you're used to doing.
It's also good that engineers and data scientists, I don't think that you have a course like this. No. You have a course in your curriculum.
It's the dark side.
Reflect about the power that you will have when you start working and the world that you will create.
Yeah, I mean,
try to think about it in political terms as well.
Yeah, it's world creating. It's the idea. I think there's a real tendency, and I'm not going to say that any of you, but I think there's a real tendency to think of technical work as not embedded in the world. And I think I really want to push against that idea and to think about that idea in really concrete terms.
And if what you're creating is the progress, you know, that we want to, I mean, what is progress, right?
Yeah, I think that's
the question. Or how can we imagine a different technology?
yeah. What kind of world can we
future?
imagine, and how?
Like when you mention like this thing about progress and like if all technology is progress, don't we tend to like create things and then and we find a utility out of it, like we tend to explore it more and discover new things that actually kind of help us or currently help us, and then like if we don't get anything out of it, we just discard it and keep on searching other. Like for example, like you have the vapor machine, the engine, vapor engine.
Yeah.
That like the Romans had it, and they were like, oh, look at it, so fun. You just boil it and you can spin it. And it's like, oh yeah, that's it. And then 1,300 years went by, and they were like, oh my God, you can do a train out of this. And they all started like finding new ways to actually use it because they actually found a use for it.
Yeah, and I think there is something to be said in two ways about this. I think this is why it's an interesting question. Is like there's one part of that story that is it required technology to develop to the point where it became useful, right? There's a narrative of progress here. It's like, okay, the Romans couldn't take advantage of like the steam engine or what have you because they didn't have the material technology, right? If they tried to make a train, it would explode because they didn't know how to make like, cast iron or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But I think there's also another story that says the social and political pressures that allow for the adoption of something like a steam engine is also inherent in its creation. And I think when you interrogate something like, I think this industrial movement is also crucially important because you look at like historical movements like the Luddites who are against that technology, their argument isn't that it's not useful. It's that it interferes too much in their social lives.
Yeah, it does.
And so that's the sort of debate that they're trying to have also. So I think there's two arguments to be had, is that a society that is beginning to value the ideas of like instrumentalized efficiency is a society that is also creating the steam engine at the same time, and that those two things are not separable. One is not causing the other, but nor are they separable from each other. It is creating this collective understanding of this revolutionary period, right? And so I think that's part of it too, right? Is that the Roman period is less interested in technologies as efficiency markets because they have a huge access to free human labor. And so they don't even need to think about it in that way, because they have an entirely different social political structure that does not incentivize that kind of development.
Well, you also have the limited, like, when you also, last class you talk about limited resources.
Yeah.
And, like, the price per, like, for that same metal, if you want to, like, do the alloys, was so much more expensive back then because there were 50 million people versus 1970s.
Yeah. No, I think all of those things are part of the same discussion, right? And I think my push is never to deny that is the case, but is always to say bringing in the social and the political to that structure only makes that understanding deeper and more complete. I think that's the answer. And I think I can tend to seem like I'm focusing as if the social and political is the only thing that is important. But I think that is because we have a tendency in our way of life now to think that the technological is the only thing that is important, and that is sort of to the side of these other political and social forces. And so I'm trying to bring them all back together. Yeah.
You use like baseball example.
Yeah.
But like the premise of no truth in data and the conclusions actually coming from the argument itself, and you extraction of them from the data is like much more prevalent in other sports. Like there's a common discussion in football, like when someone says they score X, they made X amount of progressive passes, they had X amount of expected goals.
Yeah.
And you ask them, okay, how did they actually play? Because again, they're trying to tell you a story from the data only, and in reality, when you're like in a sport as continuous as football, you actually have to see it.
Yeah, I think that's why baseball is sort of is the counter example at the beginning, right? It's like, oh, we've dominated with data, but I think in the same thing is like, yeah, how'd you play?
You don't know.
What'd you look like? Did you actually? I think it's true in baseball. It's like you got to stand there and take the swing regardless of what the numbers say, or like, yeah, how did you play as being outside of just this sort of data structure? I think is exactly true. I think maybe to wrap it up in terms of the sports metaphors, I think my argument is that we should be having the discussion more like it is in football than it is in baseball, but applied to everything.
Unfortunately, like American culture is coming more to
Yeah.
football, and it's more like that, more like they ask us. And in reality, for most of history, you watch, you analyze them
Yeah,
to get how they play.
because there's
And
money
data
and
are
sabermetrics.
Yeah.
And data is more like a tool or something that guides you towards
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, if you want to understand this, here's my one cultural thing I'll say. If you want to understand this ideology of data that I'm pushing back against, that I'm trying to reframe this, go watch the movie Moneyball.
Yeah.
It's about
There are also lots of famous cases where people like analyze and they get like top one in I don't know how to say paper.
Oh yeah, when you do like everyone bets,
Oh,
like
okay, yeah.
you do like a score, like who's a better, who scored best.
Yeah.
And there's people that like spend lots of time analyzing but like the data and they get top one. So data gives you like good insights.
Yeah, but still, like for example, in football, you can have like Uruguay broke record because they shot most times to the goalpost, but they didn't score a single goal in the second half. So like breaking the record doesn't necessarily mean you actually make the goal. So like football has the opposite of
the
baseball.
other question is like, would you hire that person to coach your team?
I don't know.
The person who wins the most bets, is that like what is the goal? I think here's the other question, right? Like, I mean, we're probably stretching this example like way beyond its utility, but I think one of the other questions is like, what is the goal that you're trying to do, right? Is the goal of like the
Objective, yeah.
thing, is the goal to, this is hard because we're talking about different goals, whatever. But like, is the goal to make the most money betting, or is the goal to run the best club?
Right.
Basketball is also one where like you can talk about data shaping the game actually.
Yeah.
Like you might know this more because it's probably in the US, but they shot a lot more 3-pointers now than
Oh yeah.
4 years ago.
But now they're going away from it.
Because not every team has to do that.
Yeah.
Like the data tells you that it's the most efficient, but if you actually
And you got
watch
some,
something,
yeah, you got some of these
might not
like
be able to.
flex centers who are just like hucking things up that they have no business
But like,
shooting.
technology actually shaped
Yeah.
the sport,
Yeah.
and you cannot get away from it now.
hmm
Yeah.
It's intertwined, right? There's this full
You might be punished for not taking 3-pointers, even though you might not be efficient at it
Yeah.
yourself, because the data suggests that you should do it. But
And so-
in the end, you have to actually live it.
And now
Yeah.
we're having that. I think in this cultural social thing is now you're seeing the development of the sport, what you would call like the social political of the sport being changed to match the sort of what the scientific technological framing of it is, right? Like the data says you should take more 3-pointers. So now at like the junior levels, you've got all these kids who only want to shoot like Steph Curry.
Well, in football, players are much more physical now,
Yeah,
and in the end, they don't prioritize other aspects of the game in that sense.
so I think
The
this is
Argentina
why.
national team has discuss about this public map.
Yeah.
Whereas players don't, like kids don't actually play football. They play what the data suggested.
Right.
Yeah, I think this is why it's such a good example, like, of a I think sport in general is good because it's limited, right? You've got this thing that you can talk about that is much more sort of contained as an example, right? At the end of the day, you can be like, are we winning more games? Versus when you extract that out to society as a whole, there's no, are we winning more games of like our lives in the world?
Well, you said we measure through GDP.
Yeah, right. We're trying to, but like, does GDP make you have a more fulfilling life?
Not necessarily.
Maybe a little bit, right? Higher GDP means you're not starving to death or what have you, and that feels important to not having a fulfilling life. But there's a point where, like, how is that relating?
Thank you, Stefan.
Yeah, no worries. I'll see you tomorrow.